Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and welcome to another episode of Fine Points with, of course, Bruce Fine. Uh, we had an announced topic, but just a few minutes ago, there was a news release on an appeals court ruling with respect to the TikTok, and basically, I haven't seen the ruling yet, the text of the ruling, just a brief review of what the ruling seems to state, and that basically is that Congress can deem a company, an app, a platform, uh, a risk to national security, and that it either be banned or has to be sold to an American company. Uh, I have to read devil's always in the details, but I'll ask Bruce in his opinion right after I state my own. My own is I think this is an awful ruling. Think about any foreign company that comes in, establishes business in the U.S., builds a very successful business model in the U.S., and then cronies go in and say, "Gee, this company is beating our pants in a very competitive marketplace, even though they shouldn't have any really competitive advantage because we have a lot more money, we have a lot more resources, we have home court advantage, and despite all that, we can't effectively compete against this company." And whatever success that TikTok and ByteDance has had in the U.S., has not been because of any sort of cronyism where they've gotten any perks or benefits from it, or that they have deeper pockets than Facebook or Google or Meta, or Elon Musk. And they just had provided a product that consumers, like better. And so their success is a function of free market capitalism and consumer choice. And that any foreign company now that succeeds, Congress can come in, then you can get the cronies knocking on the doors of people in Congress and saying, shut this business down because they're hurting my business, call them a threat to national security, and force them to either shut down or sell to me. So I think this establishes a really horrible precedent because it basically gives every business almost a free option to take over a successful foreign business in the country. So again, I have to read the details. There might be more in the decision that would allay some of my fears, but given from the brief stories that I've read on it from two places, the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, the text seems to indicate that that is a potential application of the ruling. Bruce, what's
So
your
I think first I like to draw, kind of an analog. It's not exact, but the same week that we get this ruling, we get a reaffirmation, I guess, from Mr. Trump that he's not going to permit Nippon Steel to buy U.S. steel because we can't have steel companies owned by foreign countries. And again, it's this protectionist flavor that's cast in some kind of patriotic garb, but it's really the ulterior motives is just sheer greed. If you can't compete, make them illegal, which is the opposite of the American ethic, which is build a better mousetrap if you want to get prosperous. Now, with regard to the particular ruling today, and I'd followed the arguments beforehand and the hearings in Congress that anteceded the enactment of the law, it's clear that there has never been an allegation, Jeffrey, that any consumer of TikTok, any user, has been misled, false, misleading statements, coerced, or otherwise. These are Americans who are receiving information that they find attractive for whatever reason. As far back as a 1965 case called Lamont versus the Postmaster General, the United States sought to ban any importation of literature from a communist country. This happened to be from Cuba. And the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, you have a right to receive information. You can't ban Americans from deciding whether they want to subscribe to Castro's whatever manifesto or otherwise. If they do something illegal, you can make it illegal, but you can't make a thought illegal. You have a right to think whatever you want to think. And based upon Lamont, everyone thought, well, this is a very, very strong case because you've got literally hundreds of millions of United States citizens We're talking about here the free speech, the right to receive information from U.S. citizens, not China. And we have the United States Congress without any evidence showing that China has ever obtained a national security edge over the United States because of TikTok. Well, we can speculate about it. It might happen. It's kind of the 1% doctrine of Dick Cheney. There's a minimal chance something will happen. We treat it as an absolute certainty, which comes to nonsense when you try to use that formula in real life. So the court, I believe, just bowed. Okay, you claim national security on that area. We give supreme deference to the political branches of government, and they can do whatever they want. But it is very dangerous, as you point out, because it means now basically we're creating, a safe harbor for American companies against foreign competition, not illegal foreign competition, not foreign competition based upon any artificial advantage, just because we're so anemic and frightened, we feel we want to build a fortress. That kind of autarkic thinking is a formula for the decline and fall of an economy in a country. When you're afraid of your shadow, is what I think this shows.
Yeah, I think another thing that always the law of unintended consequences is if the argument is basically that what presents the national security risk is the fact that potentially the Chinese government, or even likely the Chinese government, has access to the data that TikTok accumulates through user engagement. The same argument could be made. Any foreign government can make the same argument about Facebook, about Twitter, X, so about Google. So every other country could say to the U.S., Google Google shut down in France or England or wherever because you're collecting data on people in our country, and you're collecting data on people in our country represents a national security threat to our country. So if the argument is that any country that accumulates data on people outside their jurisdiction represents a national security threat, then basically we've destroyed this global information economy, because then everybody will become a silo, and the local government will have all the information, and it won't be shared, and there won't be any communication with people across borders, because then the question is who has ownership of the data, who has access to the data, and what devious things they can do with access to the data. I think this is really
I would add
a statement. This is just people being fearful, and driven by a sense of fear and greed. It's a successful business. Are they going to do this to unsuccessful businesses, or are they just doing it to TikTok? It seems to me they've only targeted the successful business. Let them take a look at every unsuccessful business that is having access from China, that has access to an American company, to American citizens information. And I think there's this app called Temu, that I think is like a Chinese version of Amazon or something like that. I don't know the details of it, but I see it's heavily downloaded in the Apple App Store. They must be having data. They're engaging in commercial transactions, and they have data, and that data could also represent a similar, threat to national security. There's WeChat. People are communicating on WeChat and other apps. So, what makes TikTok unique is that TikTok has become successful. That's it. It's not like it's the only source the Chinese government has, on the behavior, attitudes, interactions of Americans.
Yeah, not only that, Jeffrey, but I think the real difference as a political matter is that the heavyweights who are being threatened by TikTok, X, Elon Musk, Meta, Google, they got hundreds of lobbyists. So they're up there, they're lobbying. Don't worry, the members of Congress, we live in a plutocracy. Who's got the money? Who's given the Political Action Committee campaign donations and independent expenditures? So they responded to those heavyweights. If you don't have that big political profile, Congress wouldn't pay any attention to you. But it's another example of the warping of our political system to support the rich against the non-rich. I'd make this observation, however, and that is despite the claim, well, if we have a non-Chinese owner of TikTok, then China will never get access to the data. Now, this is the argument that is always made when you try to create economic blockades. Okay, these are all the boycotts, this or that. Don't worry. They'll just buy it from an intermediary who will say, if China's willing to pay for it, we'll get it and we'll sell it, even if it's on the black market. The same way in which those kinds of transactions occur with fentanyl and crack cocaine and all sorts of other things. If you have a huge demand there, the idea that you just impose, you wage a magic wand, okay, a boycott, it's going to work. No, it doesn't. Look at all the boycotts we got on China, on Iran, on North Korea, whatever, on Cuba for 50, 60 years. It doesn't bring any company down. It does mean it's a little more costly for them to get the products and services, but they get it ultimately anyway. So this is not going to prevent China from getting access to this data. I mean, can you imagine, Jeffrey, think about our CIA, our National Security Intelligence Establishment. We're paying people off all the time to get data in their own countries, right, with huge sums of money in cash or otherwise. And of course, the other side does the same thing. So why would you actually think this is going to work is just ridiculous. It's just, again, another crony capitalism for the big companies who fear the competitive threat from TikTok.
No, the one thing one statement I made is I don't believe there's such a thing as crony capitalism. There's cronyism, and cronyism is not capitalism.
Yeah, that's true. It's an oxymoron.
Capitalism, but yes, it's those two words should not go together because they're completely they're concepts at war with each other.
Yeah.
So if it's crony, it's not capitalist. So we have cronyism. As you know, I will reiterate my description of the United States as being a corrupt, crony, corporatist cartel run by kakistocrats. That's my definition of the U.S. system. So it's not a capitalist society. We're not capitalists. That's bullshit. You know, maybe stupid Americans buy this dream that we're a capitalist country, but we don't come close to resembling a capitalist country.
Yeah. It reminds me, Jeffrey, I forget to interject a little bit of humor here. When Leonid Brezhnev was chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, he was asked, I think, by the then president of France, I think it was Giscard d'Estaing, he said, well, there's a huge difference between, communism and capitalism. And said, and Brezhnev said, no, said, listen, capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, and communism is the opposite. Right? that's how he showed the distinction, right? Yeah, and that's what we have. It isn't quite as bad here as it is in Russia and China and elsewhere, but yeah, the crony capitalism is pervasive. It's epidemic here, and that's where you see all the money in the campaigns. When we're close to a capitalist economy, Jeffrey, the money expended in political campaigns, you could count on your hand with fingers left over. It just wasn't. You can imagine George Washington, I don't think, spent a penny, and he was unanimously elected twice. It's only when we turned to decide we wanted to be an empire and crony capitalist around the turn of the century, Mark Hanna, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, that the money kind of splurged, and then the heck with the capitalism anymore. We were just going to build fortresses to protect our businesses, and that's why at the turn of the century was all tariffs, and so they big wealthy people campaigned in Congress for huge tariffs to protect their industries from competition, and that's where the money was. And now we are a little more sophisticated, so we just ban complete area competition rather than tariffs in order to create these little moats to give the rich people protection from competition.
Yeah, mentioning tariffs, I want to remind whoever's going to be listening to our conversation is when Trump recently mentioned that it used to be great when America was able to finance its government exclusively through tariffs. I want to state a mathematical fact. Okay, back then, federal government spending was about 3% of GDP. Okay, federal spending now is 23% of GDP. So yes, it's much easier to finance the government when it's that small and it does very little, as opposed to as all-intrusive government that does all what government does. And so, people should actually do the math and figure out what kind of tariffs would basically act as a substitute for our current tax system and produce enough revenues so that it would be equivalent to about 23% of GDP of federal government spending. And for people who think, we're a capitalist country or close to it, okay, capitalist country is not a country where, if you take a look at all government spending, is about 40% of GDP. So 40% of the size of the economy is how the government allocates spending. Okay, I don't think that's a capitalist country. Okay, where basically the average person who is paying taxes works half the year for the government and half the year for themselves. And if you take a look at how savings is channeled in the country, for the non-accredited investor, their savings is channeled either through mutual funds or banks. The banking system represents, the deposit liability banking system represents a high percentage of average people's savings. And basically, the banks have capital guidelines that encourage them to basically deploy that savings into government debt. Okay, so you're not choosing how to allocate capital. You're basically forced to put your money into a heavily government regulated entity, and that heavily government regulated entity is given a huge subsidy for directing them to invest in government securities. So it's an indirect way of forcing you to buy government debt through putting your money in a bank, who then does more, who has more of its funds invested in government in securities than it does in making loans.
Yeah, so, but Jeffrey, I could just add,
because that's what the regulators want the case to be.
Yeah, Jeffrey, I think the 40% is an understatement of the role or the prominence of the government to supersede
all regulation
because it omits the regulatory state.
Exactly.
You got 200, and the regulatory state, that adds an additional $2 trillion, on the burden of the private sector to comply with these rules that have nothing to do with free enterprise or building a better mousetrap or saving lives or health or anything else like that. So when you add the regulatory state on top of the 40%, it comes out to be like 60 or 70%. And that's truly frightening. I mean, the small business people, they can't even deal with all of the bureaucratic complexities in order to just start up a business. They got everything and because they're not huge, so they can't, if you will, allocate or spread the cost of the regulatory requirements over a huge revenue base. They're small. I remember when I first started, I was thinking about hiring one employee as opposed to an independent contractor. And Jeffrey, one employee, I'd have to pay 40% more than the salary just in the bureaucratic overhead. I said, this isn't worth it. It's not worth it. And that small businesses are like that. And so that's another example of how we've squashed, free enterprise and liberty and choice under this suffocating Leviathan state.
Yeah, I think the number of the government's direct and indirect involvement in the economy, I think it's over 80%.
Yeah.
So I think it's a huge amount, and I think the only people who come close to having, free market capitalism are non-accredited investors who represent a small percentage of the total population. So I don't know if it's 10% of the population or 8% or something about that, but it's only because they basically have no limitations on how they deploy their capital. If you're a non-accredited investor, which is like 90% of the investors, essentially, you have to go through third parties, and those third parties are limited in what and how you can deploy your capital, because supposedly if you're non-accredited means you're too stupid to understand the risks associated with many different asset classes. So you're not supposed to be investing in these asset classes, because if you were smarter, you'd have more money, and then that would demonstrate that you have the wisdom to deploy capital in other asset classes. The only place that, I always find it ironic when the government says they do this for your protection, and how bullshit that is, because if I want to buy a junk bond, the government will say, an unaccredited investor, we don't want people selling you junk bonds, unless you go into a fund and you're managed by somebody there who's making sure you're not deploying too much of your capital into a junk bond fund. but the government will say nothing, if you go to your corner newsstand and take your entire savings and buy lottery tickets
Yeah.
that have a lower expected payout off, that are riskier than just about any instrument that you can find in the capital markets. And the government doesn't mind you buying that from somebody who has no sophistication to explain to you the risks associated with buying a lottery ticket. And there's no restriction on you going and not only spending all your money, they have no restriction on you going into debt to buy even more lottery tickets. So they don't mind you gambling on lottery tickets, because the beneficiary of the lottery tickets is the government itself.
Yeah.
So,
or betting on sports, sporting events. That's another one the government cleans up monetarily. Spending on the outcome of basketball and football and soccer games or whatever. That's fine and dandy, but junk bonds, taboo.
Venture capital, no, that's only for the professionals. So this is really so that's why I say the irony is there's only capitalism for the top 10%, and those top 10%, given how much money they have to influence the political process, they're also the ones who are acting as the cronies, further limiting the choices of everybody else.
Yeah, for sure.
People should just be honest about our system. Okay, it's not a constitutional republic. It's not even a democracy, and it's not a capitalist society. Okay?
Yeah. It's like they used to say about the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, it wasn't an empire, but they still called it that way. That's kind of what we have now, It's not a constitution, not a post-constitution, nothing. We still call it that, even though it's a museum piece as far as reality is concerned.
So what is it that you want to talk about, the cabinet?
The cabinet, I think that, so what's shaping up, and I guess we're still in some process of speculation, Jeffrey, because some of these names are running into headwinds in Congress for confirmation. But I do think that if we take a look across the board of the nominations that the president has announced, that he basically is only comfortable with people who have displayed absolute loyalty to him without any questions, Sieg Heil kind of attitude. There are persons largely completely inexperienced in government, like Elon Musk or Ramaswamy, or his White House counsel, others, Hegseth, and anyway, across the board, they're not people who, in my judgment, having worked in the government, will know which switches to turn on the wall in order to get things to change. So I think all these stories you read about these cataclysmic alterations in the policy from Biden when Trump is inaugurated, I think, are vastly exaggerated. You have to have brains to know how to navigate through over 200,000 pages of federal regulations. I know, because I've been on transitions before, how you have to get down to that granular level to know this guy needs to move because this case shouldn't be there. We see they're arguing the wrong way. We had to reverse a lot of decisions that are made by the Carter administration. We came in with Reagan. But you can't do that unless you know your stuff and can spot an irregularity. I do not believe, for example, that Pam Bondi could prosecute a jaywalking case. She's the new attorney general designate. Kash Patel has no idea about how to run the FBI. He's a junior person who has no experience. He thinks he's just going to stand up and order, thousands of agents. Well, what are you going to do? What's the violation? Where's the evidence? So I think that, however, this is what I think is going to happen, Jeffrey, that even though there will be in substance not a very much that's going to change with Trump, he will claim complete victory, like there are no more illegal immigrants coming in. Even if it's not true, if off by 11 million, he knows his base will believe whatever he says. It doesn't need to be connected with facts. So he has the luxury of populating his cabinet with people who can run and do the theatrics and go on TV shows, even nothing changes in reality. And he won't lose popular support, even if nothing changes, because he'll say it has changed and they'll believe it. So that's kind of where we are. The same phenomena we witnessed when Mr. Trump and J.D. Vance said that Haitians in Ohio were eating cats and dogs. It didn't matter whether they were or not. Okay, well, they'll believe it anyway. But I do not think that all the expected, kind of yanks and changes in our policy is really going to happen. Just two examples. I don't think at all, our overwhelming presence now in the Middle East, now spreading to Lebanon and Iran, or in Ukraine, or combating China, is going to diminish whatever. I think that with regard to his nominees, the China tension is going to even grow much larger with Marco Rubio. And the TikTok ban is just one example of that. I can guarantee you, these claims by Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, we're going to cut $2 trillion, unless you go after the military-industrial complex, which is like 70% of all discretionary spending and runs like $1.5 trillion or more a year. There's no way you can reach that. And they haven't said anything, zero, about the military-industrial security complex, the surveillance complex, collectively between $1.5 and $2 trillion a year. We're going to find that spending cut. And
I think the opportunity they're missing, that I think really they could have an impact, but they're choosing basically just to be, inside influence peddlers, doing nothing serious. I think if they really wanted to be serious, which I don't think they do, because I think their behavior would be different if they were, I think they would be doing exactly what Ross Perot did. You'd buy half hour of time and explain the budget to the American people. Explain how much government spends, how much it spends relative to how it taxes, where it gets its revenues from, how it funds the debt, how CBO does its estimates of future budget deficits, explain, how interest expense is kind of untouchable. Unless you start paying down the debt, which there's no plan to do that. Regarding military spending, they're not experts in establishing strategy, our military strategy. I mean, we have to have a national debate, a national discussion about what should the U.S. role be in the world. If the U.S. role in the world should be just to protect the homeland, we need a lot less money to just defend the homeland. If we want to be an interventionist throughout the world, then we have to figure out how much is it going to cost. What are the risks that we're concerned about, and that we make sure that we build what can appropriately accomplish whatever objectives we set. And it's not for Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to set those objectives. So what's their expertise in setting those objectives? So you would assume that Trump would appoint a competent person at the Department of Defense that have a responsible team managing the business. And also, it's never good to allocate authority outside formal chain of command of a business. Who runs the Department of Education? Elon Musk or the nominee for the Department of Education? Who runs the State Department? Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, or the person chosen to run, or Marco Rubio? So it seems to me that you delegate authority to whoever is the head of that. And if they want to then hire a consultant or speak to consultants, to get advice, then they can go out and do that. But what do you get right now? You get right now that they had a conversation with, I guess, Joni Ernst, and as a result of the conversation, they're going to look at the waste associated with people working remotely, okay? And they got to get people back to the office. Yeah, that's going to definitely save lots of money, okay? So we got to look at how much of the budget is discretionary, how much is non-discretionary. People have to understand what non-discretionary actually means, okay? It means it's basically an automatic pilot, okay? So, there's no serious conversation about it. And if this is what they're spending their time on issues like getting people back to work. I would sit back and say, if all the money that they need to find savings, if they think that's a good use of their time, I say they're fucking morons, okay?
Yeah.
You know,
And Jeffrey, I got to add this.
spending that the
Congress,
government does, I'm going to focus in on the cost of a few workers working remotely, where I might save, an infinitesimal part of the total government spending. Let them focus on where the real money is, not where the money isn't. Unless they just want to bullshit the American public to think that really if you deal with the bureaucracy, you've balanced the budget. Okay?
Yeah.
Which is a
Jeffrey,
lie. They know it's a lie.
Yeah,
They're not-
we need to get real here as well. Talk about remote work. When Congress has now reduced itself to a 3-day work week. I know because I'm up there all the time. They fly in Monday evening. They show up Tuesday. They have maybe a day Wednesday. Thursday evening, they're gone back to their districts. So if you want to talk about remote work, yeah, it's Congress. No, these are bankers' hours on steroids. And moreover, with regard to these recommendations, as you were remarking, Jeffrey, about they don't, Ramaswamy and Musk don't have any authority there. Knowing Washington and the large egos that populate every cabinet member, they would immediately reject anything that Musk or Ramaswamy proposed, because it didn't happen on their watch. They're going to say, well, I'll look like I'm a pawn of Elon Musk and Ramaswamy. They want to have their own legacy. They're not going to. And that's why, if you look historically, Jeffrey, at all these commissions, advisory boards, whatever, it goes back to Herbert, the first Hoover Commission. None of them ever result in anything, because the people who occupy the office who have to implement them, they want to be the authors. They want their names in the history books, not somebody else. That's what reality is. None of these are going anyplace.
So that's why they go meet with Joni Ernst.
Yeah.
They have this inane conversation of how they're going to save 50 cents. And they walk out of there and say, look at the important thing we've done. We've saved 50 cents. So, we've avoided any discussion about making any really hard decisions. And those are the decisions that really need to be made, are the hard decisions. If Trump was serious about reducing the budget deficit, I've said this in the past, and I've written the comments of people who have commented on some of these other previous podcasts, pod shoots that we do. I said, Trump could just be very simple. He could sit back and say, I'm going to make a proposal to Congress. I'm going to use the whole weight of the mandate I think I received, and hopefully the people will confirm that I received this mandate, and I'm going to challenge everyone, on every cabinet head, to cut 20-30% of that out of their budgets, and if they can't do that within the next 3 to 6 months, they're fired. So they have to, I put them in charge because they're supposedly an expert and they're personally competent. Elon, I'm sure anyone who calls Elon, he'll make his phone available. So if they want to consult Elon and Vivek on helping them do through that process, they can call Elon, they can call Vivek, they can call any fucking asshole they want to call, to get that done. But they need to get it done in 6 months. Then you sit back and say, okay, this is a credible exercise where somebody where people are working with the team of people, the bureaucrats who really know the numbers, okay, because they've been there for years, they know where the money is being spent, and they can get the real picture that they need to get, okay, and then they can make a decisions on not how I make a few bureaucrats disappear, but really all the programs that Congress has appropriated, that the bureaucrat has been made responsible for administering a program that Congress has specifically appropriated for.
Yeah. Now, Jeffrey, let me give you an example, I think, Jeffrey, of what shows the non-seriousness about budget cutting. The greatest, most stupendous waste of money by orders of magnitude in the history of the United States was our expending more than $3 trillion, more than 300 million every day, a day, for 20 years in Afghanistan to bring back a worse edition of Taliban than began. No accountability, no censures, no demotions, no one sanctioned, no one said, what in the F did we do with $3 trillion? You know who owns most of the mansions in the UAE and Kuwait today? Afghans who stole our money and bought it over there. And yet There has been zero congressional oversight, executive branch. How did we waste $3 trillion? It was way worse than the road to nowhere, that got ridiculed. This was worse.
During the COVID year of 2020, and when Trump had pushed the passage of the Paycheck Protection Program, subsequent audits determined very few paychecks were protected. That the ratio of like how much money the government spent and how much paycheck was protected was like almost $5 of spending for every $1 protected. So I think that's a pretty bad ratio. And several independent audits have concluded that about $1 trillion was wasted. So just that 1 year on that one program, $1 trillion was wasted, and it was completely wasteful spending. So
and then there's no congressional oversight, no second guessing. You just move on. And it's not even sending people to prison or things like that. No one loses their job. No one loses their prestige. Just, okay, this is how it is. $3 trillion here, $1 trillion there. So what? Move on. It's taxpayers' money. It doesn't matter. And then we'll just borrow it. We'll ask the Fed to go, print another $3 trillion. We'll sing on our merry way as our national debt soars towards $50 trillion. I mean, this is madness. This is madness.
And I don't know if you know, the person who ran the Paycheck Protection Program just now got even a better job in the new incoming Trump administration. He did such a good job of wasting $1 trillion. Okay, they're going to give him an opportunity of wasting even more money now, in the administration. And the administration that's supposedly shrinking government, now hires a czar. Okay, who's supposed to head up crypto and so the government's response to everything is still, let's build a new bureaucracy to figure out how we can regulate and control, something that we currently don't regulate and control, but we want to regulate and control. With having, we keep hearing a lot about deregulating. Okay, so yeah, we might want to deregulate certain things where businesses, are lobbying through their regulatory capture. Certain regulations that they think are harmful for them. I wrote a piece recently. I don't know if I shared it with you. I posted it on X, the BitChute account on X. But the point I made, like Elon Musk has said, and Vivek, one of both said that they should ban the Consumer Financial Protection Board. Okay. Now I'm someone who doesn't believe in regulation. Okay, so I would shut down. I'm a believer in Ronald Coase. Ronald Coase did, who was the Nobel Prize winner in economics, who also was the editor for a number of years of the Journal of Law and Economics. And he said a lot of economic studies came in front of his desk, and none of them ever would demonstrate that any regulation ever did any public benefit. So he said he was not against it. He said theoretically, conceptually, he was not against regulation. He was just never seen in his lifetime a well thought through regulation that had a positive net present value to it. So I believe in that. But sometimes,
Jeffrey, I apologize for interjecting, but it reminds me of a statement by Samuel Johnson. All theory is for it, but all experience is against it.
Exactly.
All theory is for regulation, all experience is against it. Yeah.
So I made a point in this post. I said, George Sigler did work on regulatory capture, which he got a Nobel Prize for. He was considered, the person, on the concept of regulatory capture. Probably him and Sam Peltzman. So if you haven't, and I would assert that the financial industry has been captured by the banks. So the consumer, the customer of the bank, is pretty screwed and have very little bargaining leverage. So if you have a whole bunch of regulations that benefit a specific participant in an ecosystem, and then you say, gee, we built all this regulation that has made it tilted the scale too much to one side, so I want to build another I have two things I could do. I could either get rid of all those regulations and basically leave it for the marketplace, which the government doesn't do. So what they do is if they write one regulation that tilts the scale too much one way, they write another regulation that tries to get it back into balance. So basically, the only body that gives the bank customer any bargaining leverage whatsoever is that board. So what they want to do, and I'm sure the banks are happy with it, that there is only one board out there that's a check against banks' abuse of its customers, and that's the one they want to shut down. They don't want to shut down all the subsidies banks get, okay? That would save a lot more money. You want to save a lot of money? And deposit insurance, okay? Save a lot more money than shutting down CFPB. And the peculiar thing about the CFPB, I understand it makes a profit. You know, that basically the money it gets back for predatory behavior on the head of banks covers their operating budget and exceeds their operating budget. That's what I've read. I haven't done more due diligence to see how truthful that is or not, but it seems to be, you know, a reasonable approximation. So they're shutting down an entity that might not cost the government money, might generate government profits, and it's the only entity out there that gives the bank customer bargaining leverage when they sit down and feel that the bank has been predatory towards them.
Yeah.
So,
Jeffrey, I think
I just think about this stuff and say, this is just really, it's very, very stupid. And how stupid are people to believe this bullshit?
Yeah. Jeffrey, for all the audience who has a bank account, virtually every single bank has a provision in their customer agreement with you or me and Jeffrey that says in small print, we reserve the right at any time, orally or in writing, with or without notice for any reason, to change the terms and conditions of this agreement, including kicking you out. Without notice. It can be done orally. They could stand up and says, okay, we're just nullifying your own agreement. That exemplifies monopoly power. They basically say your customer agreement with the bank is not worth the paper it's written on. The bank can do whatever it wants and you're hopeless and screwed. And they can do it orally without notice. So we wouldn't even know. You could go to an account and try to have a debit or credit card used or write a check. You wouldn't even know that they closed your account. And then you'll be sit with all sorts of other penalties, whatever. But that's an example of how monopolized the banking sector is.
Yes, and when after 2000, when they did the analysis of 2007, 2008, and the cost of the bailout of the financial system, they determined one of the reasons why the bailout was so expensive is how concentrated the banking system was, and now we have a significantly more concentrated banking system. So the rules they created to supposedly mitigate the cost of future bailouts has basically produced even a more fragile structure than existed in 2007, 2008. But of course, Elon Musk and Vivek will not make any comment on that. They were busy going out and they'll dox, you know, government bureaucrats in positions that they probably make very little money in, and they have that position. Not that they created it, is an act of Congress created that position, and they're doing what Congress has empowered that agency to do. And so why would you bring the employee who is basically, you know, a job seeker looking to find a job, and their job was created by an act of Congress, and they're filling an act. And so why is it that employee's fault for the job that they have? So, you know, why aren't Elon and Vivek talking about all the members of Congress that have passed all these stupid laws, stupid rules and regulations? And why don't they acknowledge that most of the behavior from these regulatory agencies are behaviors that the regulatory agencies are doing specifically because Congress has delegated them that authority to do those things, and Congress has delegated it intentionally so Congress can wash its own hands of the responsibility of those actions, that Congress doesn't want the responsibility of those things. And so they delegate it to an agency to do things they don't want to be responsible for.
Yeah, they feel that they get primary, Jeffrey. Think of this. This is supposed to be a system built on self-government. What a member of Congress feels is a complete disaster and headache if he has to run against an opponent, right? The idea that, you know, that they wouldn't be self-selected by a Putin or a Xi is beyond them. I mean, my gosh. I mean, if I actually voted some of these controversial things, I may provoke someone to enter the race against me. And that would be a disaster. I mean, I actually have to run to win the confidence of my constituents, which is the earmark of how democracy is supposed to operate. And they really turn it on their heads. It's like, okay, You want to have a safe seat, go to Russia or China. That's where you can have your safe seat and just do whatever you want to do to have some small prominence, have no power, and sit as an ornament to the emperor. And that's unfortunately what a very, very large percentage of members of Congress think their job is.
Well, I think we might see here, and I don't know for sure, if we take a look at some of the worst Trump appointees, the question is how many senators are going to be concerned about how this will work out for them when they run for reelection. Basically voting for some of these, what many people consider, well, some people consider them the best nominees, and some people consider them the worst nominees. But ultimately, that they will have to explain that vote if they're in a state where their election is somewhat contestable. I mean, so that's the only hope of a disciplining device, is that some of the senators might sit back and say, I want to be as loyal to Trump as possible, but I also don't want to commit suicide, and I don't live in a state where, 60% of the people are solid supporters of me. I have a reasonably contestable election, and it might be 2 years from now, and I don't want to leave a record that somebody's going to run against and beat me on. So I have to figure out how much I'm basically loyal to my own sense of survival. But then I also have to weigh that against the fact that if I don't vote the way Trump wants me to vote, maybe he will send up a challenger, against me, and I won't even be the nominee of my party anymore. So it's not whether I can win at the general election. The issue is, can I even be the nominee, when I run for re-election? So,
what the Senate might do to try to evade that accountability, Jeffrey, is simply not hold hearings and just have a voice vote, right? They don't even have a record vote. They can do all sorts of procedural somersaults. That's what they're good at, trying to evade accountability. I'm not saying they will, but that's what they could do in order to avoid the what you've described, the dilemma of, you got to be accountable because these nominees may not be kosher to your constituent, but then you're also at the same time worried, but then you're going to build, enmity by Trump. And so you're trying to avoid both outcomes.
Well,
and you do that by running away and hiding and just having by voice vote and don't have a recorded vote.
Well, I think that from my understanding, the master of managing procedures on the Senate floor is McConnell.
Yeah, but he's not the majority leader anymore. Yeah.
But the question is, now that he's unencumbered with representing the party, that he only represents himself, how much can he use his accumulated knowledge and wisdom, and how much influence will he be able to exert, where basically he's now a free agent and he can do what he believes is the right thing to do, unencumbered with having to be a spokesperson on behalf of the whole party.
I'm not optimistic for this reason, Jeffrey. There was a former Kentucky senator of much more glory than Mitch McConnell, Henry Clay. He famously said, I'd rather be right than be president. Mitch McConnell has said, no, I'd rather have power than be right. And one of the things, for example, that shows his hypocrisy is that he purports to be a staunch defender of the filibuster, right? The minority needs to defend itself. But when he's in the majority and the Senate under Democratic leadership, I think Harry Reid eliminated filibuster for judgeships, okay? Supreme Court and lower court judgeships. But that's just a rule. You can change it back at any time. When Trump was in office and the Senate was controlled by Republicans, did Mitch McConnell lead the charge to eliminate the rule that permits federal judges to be confirmed without the possibility of a filibuster? No, because Trump's in the White House. He doesn't want the Democrats to do that. So he does nothing to change the rule. He permits the filibuster to go under the bus as long as Trump's there, because it really isn't the filibuster. It's his party loyalty that means more to him than the institutional integrity of what he's doing. Unfortunately, I don't want to single out McConnell. That's the kind of people we're dealing with in the House and the Senate on both sides.
Yes, it's not high quality group of people,
No,
to say the least. And it's basically, on the most part, the same group of people who still have the power, because ultimately power in both bodies is very concentrated. So a lot of people, a lot of rookies can come in, and they can have positions in certain of the subcommittees and committees, but with exception, like somebody like an AOC, most of them never become very relevant.
yeah,
So
but even AOC is popular, but she hasn't nothing that she's ever done. The squad
right,
has ever gotten through
she's
the
had no influence on politics.
Zero influence on all the power has gravitated. It really began, Jeffrey, with Newt Gingrich. He came in and he wanted to decapitate Congress and leave all the power in the House Speaker's position. So all the money's in the Speaker. The Speaker decides who gets the committee chairs, the subcommittee chairs, the committee assignments, what bills get to the floor. And none of these subsequent speakers after Gingrich yielded that. And the same has occurred to a lesser extent on the Senate side. Part of that is because these formal powers are accentuated by the huge fundraising ability of the Speaker and the Majority Leader. So they got leadership PACs, $700, $800, $1 billion of money they spread out to everybody. So if you want to get that money, you got to be a lickspittle to these people. And they do. They don't stand up to them. And part of this, I think, is the White House likes it that way because they just need to deal with one leader in the House and the Senate to get everything done. They don't have to actually campaign and make a public case for what they want to do. And unfortunately, I go up there, I tell the peons, listen, that's just one person as Speaker. Look at all the hundreds who aren't speakers. Why don't you unify and get rid of all this freighted weight, at the top? Because that wasn't how it used to be when I came here, Jeffrey. The main power, the big figures in the Congress were Wilbur Mills, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Russell Long, chairman of the Finance Committee, Sam Ervin, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Emanuel Seller. Anyway, they were the ones who got the press and the media. They held their own press conferences. Can you imagine John McCormack? Probably nobody on this program knows who John McCormack is, who was the Speaker of the House for 10 years, right? But the Speaker wasn't nothing because the power was in the committees. It was very devolved and diffuse, and it worked. There was real serious oversight. Today, no one even knows chairman of the, all they know in Congress is who's the Majority Leader, who's the Speaker. Everybody else is a non-entity. And that makes it easier to run an empire. It's easier for the president to deal with. And it stifles debate, and there's very few hearings. And it more and more shrinks. What's the heart and soul of what ought to be an enlightened self-government is debate, is conversation, back and forth on the merits. Because only three people who who's talk.
Yes, it's most people are talking to an empty chamber. They're talking only for the benefit of raising money, and hopefully being invited to be on some news program so they can demonstrate that they can get into a leadership position. So they're all spending their time auditioning to be in the leadership position because they understand if you're not in a leadership position, you're completely invisible and irrelevant.
Yeah.
So it's the irony of the fact is that we designed a system that was meant to be a very decentralized system where most of the power resided in states and local government. And now, not only have we now restructured that the governance is basically top heavy and it's in Washington, not decentralized in the states. But then that has been further centralized by the fact that those bodies, the Senate and the House of Representatives, the governance of those bodies have become significantly centralized. So we've kind of killed the idea of a system of checks and balances and decentralization. And all we've done is we've basically created, cartels. And they're like cartels, like the drug cartels in Mexico, where they have a lot of influence and they're each trying to kill each other off. So they just use different means to do so, but their objective is the same thing, is they want to be the dominant cartel, but it's still a cartel. It's not a matter of making the system, returning it to its constitutional roots, of a decentralized system that's decentralized on multiple levels and it has multiple systems of checks and balances that are supposed to, reinforce the decentralizations. Instead, it's kind of all been perverted in the fact that it's all become centralized and we're reinforcing the centralization and cartelization of power, not the devolution of power.
Yeah, I once I posted on one of my websites, Jeffrey. There are 14 structural provisions of the U.S. Constitution that check majority rule. I call that's part of checks and balances. It's not just one or two. It's not just the three branches. 14. You can read them. I think it's now on Committee for the Republic website. But the other thing I want to underscore, Jeffrey, is that this centralization that you've described, it's self-imposed. Congress, by tradition and habit and independence, has the authority to appropriate whatever money it believes it needs to operate with brains, attract consultants, have the best and the brightest there, have real career plans for people who come and work on congressional staff. They haven't done that. There was a member of Congress from New Jersey. He wrote a big article in the Washington Post called "Why is Congress So Dumb?" Right? He said, we don't spend anything. We spend 3 cents on ourselves for every $3 million that we oversee. And this is purposeful because the executive branch doesn't get involved in how much money the Senate says we need, how much money the House says it needs. But the leadership doesn't want the rank and file to have any money. They want to lobotomize everybody but themselves, so they're not challenged. But the power is still there. I remember reading in this week's headline news one day where Chuck Schumer said, "Oh my gosh, we need to make sure the FBI does background clearances on all of Trump's nominees." I said, Chuck, Congress can run its own background. You can hire former FBI, CIA people. I was working in a congressional committee once involving Jack Brooks of Texas. He was very feisty. And he told the FBI, I'm going to do my own background check, not you, because I want people doing the background loyal to me, because they could work for me, not you. And he got away with it. But he was a very, very rare character on that score. But that's just an example how Congress mentally, they've turned them into feeling that they're ornaments on an empire. The empire means you got to have a Caesar. Caesar does everything. And the ornaments accept that they're sitting on the wall. And these kind of statements just exemplify that. They don't even know what their own authorities are, and don't have any care. If you told them, they would, I don't really want to exercise that. Let the FBI, let somebody else do that rather than us. And it's I call it constitutional illiteracy is what I call epidemic in Congress. And you can't cure the malady unless you understand what the problem is. And they don't know. You remember Socrates, he was decided the wisest person of all of Athens because the oracles at Delphi said, you're the only one who knows what you don't know and acts accordingly, and you know what you need to learn. These people don't know what they don't know. They are clueless about the staggering amount of constitutional knowledge of which they are ignorant. And so they just will kind of walk around sleepwalking,
And what they don't know, they don't want to know.
Yeah, they don't want to take the time.
Anything they don't know, they think is irrelevant to know. So any knowledge that they don't possess it because it's irrelevant knowledge to have. So I think that's one of the things I wrote you about this week. After I read an article, I'd like to get your opinion on the comment that I made when I sent you this text. Again, it was this issue of the unenforceable ethics on the Supreme Court, and they should come up with some ethics. Isn't that Congress's job? If why isn't Congress calling? Why isn't the Judiciary Committee? It was controlled at one point by Schumer. Schumer could have called up Thomas and said, we're going to impeach you. We're going to hold it. Well, I guess the impeachment has to come from the House first, right? And then the Senate.
Yeah, it would be the first.
So the House could have called up and said, with a lot of questions we want to have. We're very uncomfortable with all your lack of disclosures, your lack of candor, all the money you've taken, the perception of conflict of interest, the fact how you've made all these judgments, and we want to listen to you testify under oath, and so we want to hold impeachment hearings, and we'll make a judgment upon whether we think we should move it over to the Senate and vote for impeachment and have you have a trial. Isn't that how the system should work? If you have these judges that are being bought off or appear to be bought off or acting in a way, that impairs the institution's reputation for being, devoid of conflicts of interest, isn't that the job of Congress to sit back and get rid of these people, not for the court itself to regulate itself? It's supposed to be the impeachment process that should prevent this behavior.
Yeah. Not
What
only
what
that,
are you thinking on that?
see, with regard to the lower courts, Congress has enacted statutes, the recusal statutes that says, and this is an edict of Congress. It's not just made up by the judges, that if there's a reasonable basis to suspect your impartiality, you need to recuse yourself. And then it identifies a list of things that are relevant to determine whether you have a reasonable basis for suspecting impartiality has been compromised. That's a statute. It's not something the judges made up on their own. And so it's sure that what you've described is true in spades. We know that justice needs to be above suspicion, especially because in order to have court judgments honored, they don't have the sword or the purse. So it's got to be their reputation. It's got to be the belief of the public of the integrity of the process. They're not being compromised. And that's what makes appearances so important. And that's what makes it so unfortunate, if not calamitous, that now we have the appearance that all these justices, and maybe I don't know whether there are any exceptions at all, but some, are palling around with billionaires and accepting multi-$100,000 vacations, this or that, and the billionaires who are hosting them are not renowned for being constitutional scholars. They're not doing that because they're getting intellectual stimulation or broadening their constitutional horizons. And you add not only to these very, very plush and luxurious vacations, the fact that, at least with regard to Justice Thomas, his wife is an advocate in the cases that come before the court all of the time, open and notorious advocate. And that doesn't cause him pause to think, well, it's going to look, it doesn't matter what he says, whether they talk to or not. Anybody who's married knows it's not very likely that you'll be totally ignorant of what your spouse is doing. And it's the same kind of thing as if you had a brother or who was involved in a case before you. You're not going to recuse yourself. So these kinds of callousness, I think, towards the public perception surely justifies Congress in enacting a code for the U.S. Supreme Court and says, well, fine, we're enacting it. We don't care whether you do X, Y, or Z. We're going to enact the code. Now, we also have this issue, Jeffrey, that's never been tested. The Supreme Court's tenure in the text says it's for good behavior. Federal judges serve during good behavior, not short of impeachable offenses. Now, historically, that's been treated as though it meant life tenure, unless you're impeached. But it's not clear that that good behavior means the same thing as an impeachable offense, a high crime and misdemeanor. And there's probably authority in Congress to define what good behavior is that would not even require impeachment, that could have a judicial process to determine a good behavior and result in terminating a federal judge's appointment.
So could in practice, could Congress, if it had the willingness and desire to, sit back and say, we're appalled by this ruling regarding presidential immunity. Most of you came in, you testified in front of us, that you believe in the public meaning constitutionalism, yet this decision has no basis in public meaning constitutionalism, and so you defrauded us, and that's bad behavior, and we're removing you. We're not removing you because we disagree with your decision. We're removing you because you came to us espousing a judicial philosophy, and you're acting in contradiction to the judicial philosophy that you swore under oath was how you guided your decisions, and we believed you. We believe
they got their positions by false pretenses. They got confirmed by false pretenses, and so false pretenses is not good behavior. You're exactly right, Jeff. Congress clearly has authority, in my judgment, to do that. In fact, with regard to the Dobbs, the abortion decision, I don't want to necessarily defend Roe v. Wade, but where you have the current Chief Justice and Alito saying it was not only a precedent, it was a double precedent because it had been affirmed in Planned Parenthood against Casey, and then they turn around and overrule it anyway, without what I think able to distinguish why you're not overruling anything under the sun, including Marbury and Madison establishing judicial review. So, but this is the dilemma we confront, Jeffrey. All of what you've described is certainly constitutional. But we now have a Congress that's so droopy, that's so anemic, that's so afflicted with lassitude and just preoccupation with drivel. They won't do anything. They won't do it. I've tried with some others in the lame duck session of this Congress on the Senate side, where you have the Democrats in control, at least hold some hearings, right? Even because now it doesn't matter, there's not going to go anyplace, but at least you can provide some public education on what kind of doctrines are very inimical to self-government, to liberty, to rule of law. They don't want to do anything. They're just sitting crying over the defeat of Kamala Harris. This is the public informing function of Congress is even more important than the legislative function. You got to get information out and let the people understand what's at stake here, because they're not always in Washington, and they just sit and do nothing. I said, well, why? This is a sinecure, what you're occupying now. You don't do any work.
Yeah, it's and we keep putting the same people who do no work back. We hate the institution, but we seem to always like the person we choose to represent us at that institution. And everybody feels the same way, that they hate the institution, but they keep putting the same people back to govern, yet they expect to see different results. How do they expect how does expect the institution to be any differently if everyone says the institution sucks, but my member is great? So everybody thinks the same way, so it has the same composition and produces the same results that people think are horrible. So
I remember, it reminds me, Jeffrey, of Einstein's definition of an idiot, something that he tries the same experiment under the same conditions 1,000 times and thinks it's going to be different on 1,000. First he says, no, it's not. Done 1,000 times, don't worry, it's going to be the same.
Yes, that was his. That was. Some people have disputed whether he actually said it or not, but it's generally attributable to him. And yes, that was his definition of insanity. So Einstein had quite a few quotes about insanity and stupidity of people. So
and one of the things I like to quote from him, and it's really a hard issue. It's a little bit aside from what we're talking about directly, Jeffrey, but he said after, what happened, with the Manhattan Project in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he said, if he knew that was going to happen, they basically hijacked quantum mechanics, to make the species more proficient in killing each other. He wouldn't have done it. And all I'm thinking about with AI right now, AI is going to be hijacked like quantum mechanics. It's going right in the Defense Department. It's going to make us even easier to kill each other because you can do it very, very long distance away. There won't be any inhibition because you're seeing the victim.
Another bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
Again, another bureaucracy that's going to be embedded in, quote, the deep state by the person who claimed to drain the swamp and to destroy the deep state. So this is I keep with me, I have a list of, from some of the people who I really admire. I keep in my notes on my iPad quotes that I like to read and remind myself of. So I'll share a couple of this quote, I'm sure Kash Patel definitely swears by as his life's motto. Okay, so this is from Albert Einstein, and people who determine who they think is wiser, Albert Einstein or Kash Patel. So Albert Einstein said, "Weak people revenge, strong people forgive, intelligent people ignore."
Yeah. There's only one vocabulary word in Kash's dictionary: revenge. Right? Weaponize the department to go after anybody who disagrees with me. Yeah.
Yes. So I don't know. People seem to find more wisdom in Kash Patel than Albert Einstein. So Einstein also said the difference between stupidity and genius is that genius has its limits.
Yeah.
And he also said we can't solve today's problems with the mentality that created them.
Yeah.
So
So see, and Einstein also, where he said he was baffled, Jeffrey, and I keep coming that because this is my preoccupation is war. The proficiency in killing other people, first degree murder without legal consequences. He said the one thing that he could never understand, how do we stop war? He says that's the greatest scourge ever. And he wrote a letter to Sigmund Freud after he won his Nobel Prize in 1933. How do we stop this? And Freud said he didn't have any answer to it because it's built into the DNA, this craving for domination, control, a sense of superiority, a sense of self-esteem, not by intellect and morality and virtue, but simply because you got the raw power to crush somebody else. And that's in the DNA, built in part because, as Darwin explains in Origin of Species, the species cultivates traits that encourage survival for its own sake without any moral content. So that's what we're about. And Einstein, as brilliant as he was, and Freud, they had no clue. And that's where I come back and say the greatest political thinker in all time is James Madison. He said, well, true enough, we can't make men angels, but we can pit ambition against ambition and have the sociopaths fight against each other. So it preserves freedom for those who aren't engaged in this kind of drivel. And it worked until we decided the heck with separation of powers. We wanted to be an empire around the time of the Spanish-American War and threw it all in the trash can, which is where we are today. There's no checks, no balances, nothing.
Well, Einstein also had another endeavor, after Freud. I think it was shortly before his death, the manifesto that he co-authored with Bertrand Russell.
Yeah. But I say, I think it's an exaggeration of the species. Probably the greatest sermon ever delivered, the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus, is in the most bloodstained area in the history of the world. So words, it's not words. We're just trying to change. We can't change the DNA. We got to change the institutional balance, the equilibrium of power. I say to pit the evil against the evil, because that's what the nature of the species is. We're not naturally benign. We're not naturally benevolent. We're not naturally kind and thrusting and craving intellect rather than hormonal gratifications. We're not. We've got to accept that fact and recognize in order to avoid self-ruination, we have to prevent ourselves from destroying ourselves. And that means being very candid about what the nature of our species is. But we don't, because we're species narcissists.
Yes, I very much agree with everything you just said. So Bruce, how would you like to wrap up this conversation today? What would be the message that you would like to communicate?
Well, listen, everybody who's on, I always welcome. I hope you find these discussions provocative and try to learn this. But I think the message is, I think that the expectations that the world is going to change, there's going to be a turning point in history when Trump is sworn in on January 20th, 2025 has been vastly exaggerated. You'll find that the rhetoric is going to change, but in substance, I think there'll be very little. And therefore, if that diminishes your anxiety, good.
I like that conclusion. Thank you very much, Bruce. Have a wonderful weekend.
Okay. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Bye.
Bye-bye.